Hey, thanks for joining us or me today, this afternoon. And today's topic, what we're going to be discussing is this idea of playing video games. And it's going to be a short little overview of some of the key, or maybe not even key, some of the interesting aspects of looking at video games within the area of media and communications research. Hopefully some of this will be of interest more broadly in terms of how we engage with any type of media content. So there's a couple of key aspects, I guess, to look at. One is the key material that I'll be drawing upon. Right, there we go, the references that I've got. So I will just remove myself from the image so you can see more clearly what sources I'm going to base this discussion on. So what I'm primarily looking at is Ruddock's ideas that he maps out from Chapter 11 of Researching Media Content, Games, Texts, and Discourses. That's in his book, Exploring Media Research, Theories, Practices, and Purposes. Then look a little bit at Paul G. and his article back in 2006 about why game studies now, video games are a new art form. It's a little old, but he does define video games clearly. So what we're looking at there is a kind of definition. And I'm going to draw upon Zimmerman's research back in 2009, where he looks at gaming literacy, game design as a model for literacy in the 21st century, just to give us and set up an idea of how we define playing video games. So again, what we're looking at overall is this idea of how audiences and users engage in media content, and some key questions within that. So, to set the scene, let's start with a nice big quote. So this is from the Andy Ruddock reading, and to read along, he says, practically speaking, our research questions frequently come from content. We see, hear, or read something that we instinctively feel to be imaginative, insightful, unique, offensive, maybe dangerous, then set about researching what makes this content worthy of attention as something that does or says something about or in contemporary culture. I think I might be missing something there. Anyway, video games are a great example. So what I want to refer to here is that Andy Ruddock's setting up the idea that when we look at television shows, in this case video games, what's a really interesting thing to do when you're writing any research is to draw upon some experience you have, right? Why are you doing that research? Well, when I was playing the game or watching the TV show, I had these following thoughts or concerns or issues. And then from that, it gives you this idea that this is worthy of attention, right? There's something imaginative about it. There's something insightful or unique or offensive. So I want to set that as the scene for why it's interesting to look at video games. And I think many of us have experiences with these texts. And then practically speaking, how do we move from that, that kind of gut feeling we have that there's something really interesting going on here to then say something about it as a researcher. And some great examples of this that certainly I've come across with video games. This was back in 2009. Wonderful article from Kotaku saying, Rabbi overcomes fear of Nazis courtesy of Call of Duty. So, of course, Call of Duty, very popular first-person shooter game. It's one that Ruddock refers to in his readings within the context of concerns around violence in video games. What I love about this article is it's addressing the question of violence in video games. Like, this is a first-person game set in World War II, involving many things that some people would be very concerned about. They would maybe label it as desensitizing, encouraging violent attitudes. Yet, it all comes down to context. And here we have a context around being an audience member or a player of the game, where that context is seen really positively. So a rabbi talking about his experience of overcoming it. So if we just read through it, I think it's quite a nice setup for the article. The article starts by saying, somewhat understandably, given the fact he's Jewish, Rabbi Micha Kelber has always had a few issues with Nazis, until, that is, he played Call of Duty World at War. Writing for the Jewish newspaper website Forward, Kelber says that World at War's in-your-face moral choices, which you get quite often in the Soviet missions, do more than just give you a break from the kill everyone in sight routine. They help you explore the morality of war. They help make war a more visceral experience for Jews. And they help cure a man of his fear of Nazis. How so? So Kelber here, a direct quote from him, explains, the surprising benefit of the game was that throughout my entire life, since sneaking into the synagogue library with David Yogobans and paging through a book of Nazi medical experiments, I've had nightmares about Nazis. Jewish summer camp didn't help. In games like Call of Duty, you get unlimited lives. You keep playing the game until you have, until you are victorious. It's a safe place. When your character dies, you may have to go back to a checkpoint, but that is simply inconvenient, never tragic or final. You will always have another chance to kill your demons. One morning, I woke up extremely aware that I had just had a Nazi dream. No surprise given that I wrote this review and played the game late into the night, but I was shocked that it did not scare me as it had done in the past. The back of my neck was dry. The game had subconsciously flipped a switch. Although clearly there are still very real threats to Jews in the world, the feeling that Nazis were a threat to my existence was created by teachers and rabbis, rightly making sure that I knew my history. In truth, the specific anxiety was not real but virtual, and I could vanquish it virtually as well. So again, a really interesting case there of engaging with content which could be dismissed as simply being violent and caught up in arguments around media effect concerns. But as always, context is important. How are people actually engaging that, and what are the stories they're telling of engaging in those spaces? And the Andy Ruddock reading points that out really strongly with talking about how reviewers of the World War I game, Valiant Hearts, talk about the type of violence as one that actually fosters empathy. And, you know, what's interesting here is being put forward a case of there is such a thing as good contextual experiencing media which provides good contextual experience of violence, right? So context being central here. In this case, you know, what I love about this is the story he tells is about this aspect of video gaming, which I think is really important, the idea that you can fail and fail often. And through that idea of the unlimited lives or the kind of education and knowledge pathways you get through games, you can, you know, replay levels. You can fail, you can develop, you can overcome, I guess, your fears of failure. You can overcome your fears here of the Nazis. You can overcome your fears here of you know, over-dramatizing, over-mythologizing something by the kind of therapeutic value of the fail and fail often, you know, die, respawn, repeat cycle of gaming. So again, part of that idea is context is central here. All right, so here we have some really interesting points that are also raised in this second article about a parent asking a son to play Call of Duty, COD, according to Geneva Convention. So Call of Duty, another first-person war game. What was interesting, what I love about this story is the 13-year-old son who wanted to play it, as the article goes on to discuss, was quite young. So obviously, in this case, the father decided to use it as a space to say, all right, well, we're going to play this game, but we're going to use it as in this case, an entry point to learn about, you know, moral, political frameworks, like the Geneva Convention, right? A convention set up to address and avoid the chance of war atrocities and foster rules of engagement. So a fascinating case here of, again, taking a game which many people would see as having maybe concerns around how it expresses violence, but using your own rule set, right? That's one of the great things about video games in terms of its ability to be modded, or its ability for people to play it according to a different rule set than the ones the game designers had originally intended. Obviously, Call of Duty had intended for hopefully moral gameplay, but, as a father, if you wanted to, it's an interesting experiment to say, we're going to play this game according to the Geneva Convention. And obviously, in this case, the convention could be something that emerged later after the game was set. This final example that I want to give is from an article by Barry Joseph back in 2008, titled Why Johnny Can't Fly, Treating Games as a Form of Youth Media Within a Youth Development Framework. And as you can tell, the screen capture here is from Grand Theft Auto, I think the third one, and it's the taxi mission. What's interesting about this image, the reason I chose this image, was that Barry talks about this moment of realizing how important context is to understanding particularly violence in video games. And so he was saying he was watching a kid play Grand Theft Auto, and he was doing the taxi mission, and while he was playing the taxi, all he saw the young kid do was constantly hit citizens, right? Hit the non-player characters as he was driving the taxi. He'd hit the non-player character, and that character would stand up and then get in the taxi and drive off. But he'd continually keep hitting, kind of violently, these people. And so part of the question he asked afterwards was, what's going on there? Because at first he felt, here's a typical example of kids getting violent in this game. But the reason the kid explained that he was doing this was because the game is glitched in terms of it's very difficult, he was explaining, to get some of, like for the taxi mission, you've got to get a certain number of fares, and it can be a real pain to get pedestrians in your taxi. So it's just quicker to hit them first, and then it triggers in the game code them more easily getting into your car, right? Obviously, the kid realizes this isn't real violence. He's not performing real violence. The reason that he's being violent in the taxi is not a visceral thrill of, I just want to hit people. It's, this is the easiest way for me to accomplish this goal. So again, we can't divorce what we see from the context and the explanation of why it's happening. In a case like this, it has nothing to do with enacting violence per se. It's a means to an end in a way. It's not, the kid's not treating it as, I want to be violent. He's treating it as a mechanic to achieve a result in the game. So Ruddock makes this point in the reading by saying textual analysis, which is a mode of research which looks at, as we saw earlier in week 2, semiotics and the meaning of text. So textual analysis addresses the social life of media phenomena, not the meaning of a text. And I think that's a really important distinction to say. So, for example, in this scene and the setting that we discussed, the taxi driver mission and the kid just hitting all the pedestrians, we could do a textual analysis just talking about the meaning of this as violence, right? The enactment of violence. But that would really miss the actual meaning of this as a cultural or social experience with a thinking, breathing adult or kid in this stage making sense of it, right? The real meaning of this textual analysis is the idea of, in this case, revealing the kind of hacking the rules of the game, right? It's more, textual analysis is a more interesting revelation of how rules of gaming work and how gamers can get around the rules of a game than violence per se. So textual analysis here could be misleading if you just try to describe the meaning of the text, but if you describe it as the social life of a media phenomenon, it becomes much more interesting. That is, media content can inform us about media culture, right? So again, the broader question around media violence, why it matters, and how to unpack that by talking about context being important. Where this is important, again, it's slightly old, but around that same time as GTA, and again, many of those articles were being written, here we have an article in Australia talking about why Michael Atkinson, who was one of the Attorney Generals for South Australia, which held up the R18 plus classification for video games in Australia until quite recently, said, the reason why he's holding out allowing Australia to have R18 plus classification for video games is because video games are a different type of engagement, right? He was concerned that the type of audiencing, the type of using that you do when you play a game is just different from when you read a book and play a video game, watch a movie or a TV show. And because of that, he was concerned that violence, particularly violence represented in video games, is something that needs to be controlled and governed. The idea that games are more immersive, right? So, here we have Assassin's Creed. And there's a lot of stories about the immersiveness of Assassin's Creed. Again, a game on the surface that could be perceived as quite violent. You play literally a violent type, a character performing violent acts, often an assassin. But what's really fascinating to me, again, is hearing stories of the gamers when they play Assassin's Creed, or some of the unusual ways that Assassin's Creed features later in life. So I know I've spoken with friends that have traveled to Italy, for instance, and they'll say, my God, I feel like my son was the tour guide because he knew so much about these areas we were traveling through because he'd played Assassin's Creed set in that area. And again, so that's a really fascinating story about a game on the surface. You could say, oh, this is quite violent. But nevertheless, if you look at context, you could say, well, how do you explain this story of Assassin's Creed being used as a way to understand the architecture and history of a location and being very useful as a tourist in those spaces? So again, very immersive. Again, the same kind of things that Michael Atkinson is saying, so he's concerned about video games because it's immersive, that children in particular are vulnerable. And again, we'll look at this more next week when we look at media effect and moral panic arguments. But for today's discussion, what I want to talk about is again this idea that trying to understand the meaning of Assassin's Creed and the meaning of playing Assassin's Creed has to be understood from a cultural level in terms of the stories people are saying to make sense of this game. And obviously, you can talk about the story of people who have not played these games, like Michael Atkinson, or the story of people that do play these games and the unusual stories they might tell that don't conform to those stereotypes. Here, just an article again attesting to the reason it's interesting to look at video games. Again, this is back in 2013 with the release of Grand Theft Auto 5, setting records as sales zoomed past at that point $1 billion. It's gone on to make more, of course. The reason this article was there was because it was such a breakthrough moment of video games being the leading media content record setter, that it wasn't movies, it wasn't TV, it wasn't novels that was setting the benchmarks for huge sales, it was video games. And I think the Grand Theft Auto 5 indeed has gone on to be the single, one of maybe the most successful, the most amount of money kind of accumulated from that title. Right, across media, across all cinema and books and so forth. So the idea that Grand Theft Auto and other video games are enormously commercially successful media content. So, and again, to return to Ruddock's point, one of the really interesting things about video games is that it's really recycling older concerns about the effect of media. You could go back to rock and roll music and its effect on teens and delinquent concerns, Dungeons and Dragons, the comic books, right? And we'll talk about that more next week. But, video games are important to look at because they continue quite perennial debates about the impact of media upon audiences. So here we have an article talking about Minecraft being banned in schools because of perceived violence that it was encouraging. Articles again from ABC Science talking about violent games linked to kids' aggression. Concerns around addiction linked to video games, linking it to, in this case, the headline, video game craving bad as alcohol. In 2012, I remember there were a number of articles about this phenomena, which was death by gaming, an investigation into Taiwan cafe fatalities. This was the case of sad case of people who were dying in these enormous cafe facilities. Again, all this needs to be put into context in terms of saying, statistically, what are we looking at here? This is, quite minimal. Does it actually represent the gaming experience generally? Another red flag around video games has been its, again, impact on our perceptual capabilities. Here's an article, the headline, Video Games Cause Pseudo-Hallucinatory-like Experiences. It's an interesting one. Again, this is talking about after having played immersive games, in these cases too long, right? After finishing a game, you can have residual traces of that immersive space. So you might hear sounds from the game still. You might still see the world through the lens of the gaming space in a way, right? Interestingly, there was an article published here at the University of Tasmania a few years back, which researched Grand Theft Auto players in Hobart, talking about one of the interesting things they found from that research was how gamers of Grand Theft Auto actually saw Hobart as a much more cosmopolitan place than they'd realized. As they drove around Hobart, they would talk in their interview about seeing parts of Hobart that reminded them of the game, right? That Hobart, they realized that Hobart had aspects of a San Andreas or another kind of fictional location modeled on a US city, obviously smaller scale, but nevertheless the fact that, as opposed to this article, which is saying the pseudo-hallucinatory life-like experience is something that is of concern, we could equally say, well, no, let's talk about what those experiences then translate as. In the case of Hobart GTA players, it meant they saw this city not as a backwater, peripheral city space, but as having actual cosmopolitan settings, right? And people and a life to it that they hadn't really recognized until they saw it within the Grand Theft Auto kind of mindset playing the game. Here's another media cautionary one. Grand Theft Auto 5 were removed from Target and Kmart because of concerns around sexual violence and controversy. And again, it's not denying the impact of the representation of, and certainly I think gaming, and the article points out very effectively through Anita Sarkeesian and Feminist Frequency YouTube channel, there is an enormous problem with representational issues, particularly gendered ones, which are holding back the ability of the gaming industry to really have a more embracive culture to it. The whole Gamergate phenomena and the toxic masculinity that has popped up within gaming, I think, testament to that. But it is also saying, all this needs to be placed into context. All of this needs to be explored in a much more complex way by looking at the entirety of the gaming space, not just cherry-picking one or two examples, which might not be representative of the broader gaming experience, particularly if we include mobile phone games and other spaces. Video games are also important to look at because they're often incorporated into narratives of explaining real-world violent phenomena. This one way back talking about Mass Effect being linked to school shootings. And again, I want to touch on that simply to flag why we're looking at video games and to indicate that next week we'll be looking at the context of this within a moral panic narrative. So I'll hold off on that until next week. So what I want to turn to now is this question of how do we define a video game? And here we could define it like we do with any media content by breaking it down into genres, right? And again, that's useful in terms of recognizing the diversity of games. So the type of moral panic media effect stories we just saw, I think, skew what video games are defined as. Often they only focus on action games, and often within that only shooter games. And again, that would be very unrepresentative of at least the other 8.1 types of genres which exist within video games to start with, let alone the types of stories people tell within playing those games. So again, it's useful to start at that point of saying, games include action, adventure, role-playing, simulation games, strategy games, sports games, massive multiplayer online games, and others, to just recognize the diversity and that we can't make rather broad, generalized statements that, games only do one type of thing, or we should be concerned of games because some of them do this type of thing. Gaming literacy researcher Eric Zimmerman provides 3 key aspects to define video games. So he says games should be understood as a type of gaming literacy, right? So when you play a game, you need to develop a literacy around it, or we all have a type of literacy which merges around it. And that literacy is broken into 3 spaces. A literacy around the system, a literacy around the play, and a literacy around the design of the game. So to break that down a little bit further, by system, Zimmerman means a system is a set of parts that interrelates to form a whole. So the rules of the game. Right? So we can understand that maybe by thinking of something as well known as Mario Brothers. So the system of Mario Brothers that I briefly want to talk about here is that it's a platformer game which involves side-scrolling as you use the controller to overcome a series of obstacles to collect points. They could be coins to complete this level. What's interesting about the system of the game that I want to speak to, that the parts are interrelated to the whole, is speaking specifically of how jumping works in Mario Brothers. So to jump, you only need to press one button once, let's call it the X button, and it causes a jump reaction. As you play the game further, there are moments in the game you need to jump quite wide chasms. And if you only press the button once, you won't jump far enough. But intuitively, what many people do to overcome that is press it twice, which works, right? It gives you a larger jump. So the idea being that there's a system at work, right? So you're being trained into using a controller where you can iterate from that to understand the rules of the game, right? So to jump, okay, I press the button once. To jump longer, it's two buttons. And if you look at how we intuitively understand games and how games can intuitively tutor us to play them, we can see this type of structure at work, right? A kind of sense of okay, obviously I need to duck or do something further here. Let's try and set up these buttons. Great, yeah, I'm actually looking at the comments as well. It's good to see you as well, Silent Him. I could use cool. Wonderful to have another Twitcher here. And indeed, yes, as part of COVID-19, we're rolling out the lectures on Twitch to see what it's like. So the second definition of gaming is this idea, of course, the most obvious one, that it's a form of play. So Zimmerman defines that as play in many ways is the opposite of rules. As much as rules are closed and fixed, play is improvisational and uncertain. Players do not just play games, they mod them, engage in meta play between games, and develop cultures around games. Games are not just about following rules, but also about breaking them. And I was thinking of an example about that idea of playing. I mean, obviously we could talk about using the controller and so forth as a type of playing, but this definition is taking a broader idea about playing really being about igniting the imagination of the gamer, and through that setting up, playing is not just, as the end of this quote says, games are not just about following the rules, so it's not just about understanding how to get Mario to jump, but it's about breaking them. And I think a great example of that I was thinking of was Bowsette, right? A few years back, I don't know if people remember this, because it really sums up an aspect of playing, and also playfulness, right? So Bowsette, within the Mario space, was a kind of fan fiction type of creation from a mechanic. So in one of the later iterations of Mario, there was a crown that we can see there in the first panel that was introduced, linked to a character, which basically turns them into a kind of Princess Peach version of that character. And then people began speculating, gamers of Mario started speculating as to, okay, what's the mechanic of this crown? What does it do? And through that, in a comic series, a fan comic series, this fan artist suggested, okay, well, maybe the Bowser character puts the crown on, causing a gender flip as well as a kind of Princess Peach flip, right? So hence came the Bowsette character, which is a great example, I guess, of play. So again, that definition that they're engaging in a kind of a mod action, so they're modding the game to introduce a new character. In this sense, they're not literally modding the game, but they are, through a comic, introducing a new character. There's a meta play between games, right? Or certainly there's a meta play going on here in terms of the storytelling of the Mario series. And again, it's not just about following the rules, but breaking them, right? So here we have a new object introduced into Mario, and then playing with what the mechanics of that new object might be in terms of gender, flipping, villain, the Bowser character flipping into a romantic interest. It does sum up, again, this idea of it's difficult to explain the text here without explaining the culture of fan fiction work, of modding, of the gamer community. Again, the complexity of understanding gaming here. The third definition is design, the process by which a designer creates a context to be encountered by participants from which meaning emerges. And so here, of course, there's a clip that I've included in the Milo for the unit to have a look at the PBS Game Show's Game Design 101, how Mario makes you a better player, which goes through that idea, that the design of Mario is really a great one to look at in terms of, an overall holistic knowledge kind of learning, a kind of, as the article suggests, or the YouTube here suggests, it's really more profoundly about becoming a better player through the Mario Brothers space. The other way to define video games is this theory by Johan Huizinga called Magic Circle, which is worth shouting out here because it's, again, a way of defining this point that Michael Atkinson speaks to. So earlier we had a look at that shot that Michael Atkinson, the South Australian Attorney General, saying there shouldn't be an R18 plus classification because games are different from other media, and he was concerned because of that difference that it would have a much more severe effect. And one way we could understand that difference, which I agree is there, video games are different from television, movies, and books, is the Magic Circle idea. So the Magic Circle idea is that once certain things are brought together in a play space, we'll call that the Magic Circle space, then each object has a new set of rules to it. So here the example is, in the real world, if you've got a ball and you happen to kick it into a net, that might not mean anything in particular. But if that act of kicking the ball into a net happens to occur within, let's say, a stadium with people watching it and a team playing another team, it's soccer, we realize that means something. It's a magic circle. It's a way in which we talk about, okay, here we're entering a space which has specific rules and ideas which govern these acts in this context. Outside of this context, kicking a ball into a net won't give you a point, but in this context it will. So this is seen as a way of understanding how video games work, that we understand within the game an idea of the symbolic meaning of each of these acts. So the magic circle is then broken down into this idea of a game's defined by its boundaries, right? So if we think about games more inclusively to include sports, we could think of tennis, badminton, golf, right? It's a specific space that's set up. It's a court, it's a chessboard, a game board, a display. There's time that's often involved, the quarters of a football match, and so forth. And to play the game, you have to enter it. And that entering is really important in terms of it excludes the real world. That is, in the real world, kicking a ball into a net doesn't give you a point. But in the game world, it will get you a point, which means you're closer to winning, right? That idea of game world reality is created. And when the game's over, you exit and the real world takes over, right? The idea that there's a clear delineation between the magic circle that happens in the game, and then you leave the game, and then it's the real world. That idea has kind of been further developed with the idea that, so here we have the real world, right? The person in the real world will have questions, fears, uncertainties, responsibilities. So if we think about the story of the rabbi at the start playing Call of Duty, he had these concerns about what that meant. Then he played Call of Duty. Within that space, he was able to experience the fourth category there, the catharsis of overcoming the overly mythologized villain of the Nazi. And then he took that experience out into his real world again to say, and through that I exercised this existential threat of the Nazi other that had haunted me. All right, so again, it's not that the real world is discretely separate, that, it ends like Huizinga initially imagined. People do say there's a kind of residual experience that you are changed in a way through that, or that you can be. So, again, to return to Ruddock's quote, the idea that textual analysis, and when you're thinking of your experience as a player, it should be about the social life of the media phenomena, not just about the meaning of the text, right? Not just that, Mario Brothers involves, collecting coins and so forth and rescuing Princess Peach, but that it's about, learning how to learn, how to fail and fail often to develop skills, right? I mean, you could say that more generally, that it's training a type of socialization of knowledge, right? Which, again, have a look at the PBS YouTube clip for an example of that. So, again, ultimately, that media content can inform us about media culture here is what we're directed to. So how do we get from content to culture? What we need to do is present a clear reason around why you've chosen a text to look at. In terms of the assignment you're thinking about, that text could be watching a television show, reading a book, listening to a podcast, or playing a video game, right? So why have you chosen that, and why is it significant? And through that, we can see the basic building blocks of doing a research question. So it should always come from, as Ruddock points out, this idea of what are you doing, why are you doing it, and how are you doing it? So if we start first with what, think about what your personal interests are, and within those personal interests, what's an interesting object of analysis? So what are the stories you have, if we're looking at video games, that link your personal interests to a video game? What were your first experiences of playing a game? What were your expectations when you played a particular game? What was the reality of that? How did it make you feel? How have you negotiated anger, sadness? I mean, Leonard Maltin, one of the well-known film reviewers, said video games will never be art because they will never cause people to cry. Now, of course, we can look back on that and think, wow, how wrong is that? But at the time he was stating that, he had a very narrow definition of what video games were, which was simply kind of 1980s coin-op games like Space Invaders. Now, through more mature games that we can experience today, we can see that there are people that have stories of having cried playing a video game, having amazing epiphanies. I know students have told me about the Final Fantasy game which involved the death of a key character, the female kind of romantically linked character, I think, at the end. That was a real gut hit, having a character in this RPG Final Fantasy game die. So again, the idea that there might be emotions linked to it. And then the second column asking that why question needs to come from the readings, from the academic literature. Learn about the theory and understand the motivations of previous research. So through reading Ruddock's piece and Zimmerman's piece and the other reading for this week, we can see these ideas of research resolving, hopefully, aspects of these questions. All right, so you might want to think of it in terms of the magic circle, or ideas of the design or playability of the game, or the rule set of the game, and then how, right? So in terms of this work we're doing at the moment, the methods that we're looking at addressing are your own stories, but you can certainly draw upon, like Ruddock does, ideas from game reviewers to contextualize it, so do some discourse analysis to explain your evidence through. So just to end with the Ruddock reading, what I found really interesting about that, again, was he tackled head-on one of the main questions around video games, which is the idea of violence, and not simply then saying, well, the media effect argument is wrong or right, but to say, where are these debates coming from, right? So obviously on the left-hand side, we've got the image of America's Army, which received quite a lot of criticism and concern from, we could characterize it as kind of conspiracy theorist-oriented individuals who felt this was a recruitment video for the U.S. Army through video games. And then on the right, the Valiant Hearts Great War game, equally seen as a game set during wartime, but as Ruddock points out, if you look at the reviews via Metacritic of Valiant Hearts, this is seen as good violence. This is seen as a violence which fosters empathy, which fosters a sense of memorializing and creating memory of the Great War, and through that being able to have a much more effective empathy towards that space. So a sense that this is violence done well. So again, the idea being that violence always requires context. So one thing you can do if you're approaching the question of video games is to look at what's the conversation that's around the game in the review literature. That's an important step to make, of course, because what that's tapping into is a sense that these are game reviewers for who it's their job to be able to explain and contextualize why a game matters. And this hopefully avoids errors in research such as cherry-picking a game which you choose because it's going to suit your argument, but it might not be a game that has had really any popularity around it. So statistically, the fact that not many people have played it means how representative is that game of the play experience you're looking at analyzing. Also, it may show that the game itself isn't representative as a genre of the piece of work you're doing. So again, looking at the literature around game reviews can be incredibly useful in terms of tapping into what is the broader conversation that I can contribute here through my research into this space with, which is one of the most important parts of all research, to actually contribute towards a conversation so it's not just an echo chamber. So Ruddock does that by setting up the idea of media content, looking at video games, setting up 2 case studies, America's Army versus Valiant Hearts, and unpacks this through professional game review comments via Metacritic, right? So it's not just kind of Reddit posts, it's a sense, well, this is actually a critical community who are positioning this text as really important because of these reasons. And answers that question, so what? Who cares about this game? Hopefully by deferring to video game reviewers and doing some analysis of that, you're providing the reason as to why this is a topic of interest. Well, because people in the industry see it as an interesting text. It's doing interesting things. It's groundbreaking. It's novel. It's doing violence appropriately. So for Ruddock, he breaks down 4 key points here. Through doing that, we really, again, get to understand how gaming studies has emerged as a really interesting discipline of theory and research. Within gaming studies, the paradigm of war games and memory gets highlighted as the way in which we can contextualize what's going on in Valiant Hearts. Power of numbers is important, again, because he's pointing to the fact that Valiant Hearts had a statistical weight to it, right? I forget what the percentage was if we look at the Metacritic data, but the Metacritic data provides, a sense that there's a weight to those numbers, right? That, again, what it's hopefully helping you do in your research is to say, this isn't just something I've cherry-picked. Statistically, these numbers can't be contested. 583 reviewers have come to this score, which means something, right? Which means that people see this as a worthy text, as something which is a genuinely groundbreaking contribution, right? So power of numbers, and then he does 2 methods, kind of content analysis through those numbers, and the second method is a discourse analysis of those game reviews, right? So content analysis simply means delivering relatively uncontroversial facts about media content in this case. So these numbers saying, well, it's got this score, it's had this number of ratings, and we have to accept that, and therefore this tells us certain things about the value of this text. He then goes on to position that in terms of how that helps choose the text he focuses on. So it presents a clear reason about why this text is significant, right? It's not just me who thinks this, it's the critical community that thinks this. And it also places it within a debate, right? So he compares this in terms of America's Army does a very different thing than Valiant Hearts does. And therefore, if you're only looking at America's Army and saying, violent video games will always cause problems, then that's not going to represent the entirety of, the games set in world wars, such as Valiant Hearts, which is critically acclaimed as being a very progressive text in that space. So he then uses the method of discourse analysis. So quickly to define that, it's a way of talking about something that frames that thing. So in this case, we're talking about representation of violence in war games with a view to encouraging a particular outcome, right? So this would be, how have the reviewers talked about the thing, Valiant Hearts, to encourage a particular outcome, that is to say this is a good game or a bad game, right? So again, he's looking at how has the reviewers used particular language and evidence and persuasiveness to have a particular outcome or argument put forward. So Ruddock codes this in terms of 3 main themes, right? So he looks at cultural politics. He says that many of the reviews, if you read them, define the type of war represented in Valiant Hearts, the war in Valiant Hearts, define violence more generally through these key terms, uncreative violence, genre innovation, gender, and identification, right? Gaming content, aesthetics, technology, gameplay experience, narrative, and the cultural politics of the Great War, memorialization, the topic of bodies and learning. So these were shared codes. So as Ruddock read and reread all of the reviews, he categorized the themes which emerged from that. So he would have found X number of reviews talked about the idea of uncreative violence. They talked about genre innovation. They talked about gender. They talked about identification. So this is, again, really bringing us back to this table. What Ruddock is modeling here is how to do research. Arrive at a question with the what. What are you analyzing? If it's drawn from a personal interest, it's more likely to be authentic and genuine and hopefully drive all the writing you need to do. Why? Locate your research in the theory. So do your readings, understand what the debates are, so then you can locate, in this case, Valiant Hearts in terms of research around memory and war or media effect. And then how? So he looks at reviewers of Valiant Hearts and codes the key repeated terms, recurring themes, points of conflict, and unusual occurrence to size up what the value is of Valiant Hearts. So, I hope that has provided some interesting thoughts around how you can approach let me try to bring back my image. No, I can't do that. The reading for this week. And, there I am. Oh, back. Yeah, gosh. What a journey. Okay, so quite a lot to get through. I hope you found some of it interesting. And we'll discuss more of it over class this week. For those that were able to join the Twitch stream, thank you for your patience. 52 minutes of me talking. I think that was pretty good. So I look forward to any thoughts or comments people have. And next week we're looking at media effect. So I'll probably look at some other examples of video games then as well. Thank you again for listening and have a good weekend.